The neon of the Sands Hotel has a way of casting long, jagged shadows, the kind of shadows where even a king of cool like Dean Martin couldn't hide from the truth he'd spent 40 years keeping under glass. What does a man see when the cocktail parties fall silent and the stage lights finally fade to black? For Dean Martin, the effortless charm was a mask, a velvet curtain drawn over a Hollywood that was far more sinister than the postcard suggested. Before the silence took him in 1995, rumors swirled that Dino had finally broken his code of omerta, naming the figures who didn't just play villains, but carried a darkness that was all too real. Tonight, we reveal the 9 souls Dean Martin allegedly warned us about: the iconic, the unresolved, and the truly dangerous. Clifton Webb. Clifton Webb was the definitive architect of the cinematic sneer. Long before the era of the modern anti-hero, Webb reigned supreme as the personification of high society arrogance. He did not merely walk onto a soundstage, he glided into it, carrying the invisible weight of 1,000 refined ancestors. To the moviegoers of the 1940s and 1950s, he was the sophisticated uncle, the acerbic critic, and the man who always knew which fork to use. His performances in films like Laura and The Razor's Edge were masterclasses in detached elegance. However, Dean Martin allegedly saw something far more calculating beneath that perfectly tailored exterior. Dino supposedly whispered that Webb's sophistication was not a character trait, but a fortification built to hide a deeply unsettling psychological interior. The core of the mystery surrounding Webb was his suffocating, almost spectral devotion to his mother, Maybelle. This was not a standard bond of familial love. It was a symbiotic obsession that many in the Rat Pack found profoundly disturbing. Even as a grown man and an international superstar, Webb's life was entirely dictated by the whims of his mother. When she finally passed away, his grief did not manifest as sadness, but as a complete psychological collapse that bordered on the macabre. Rumors swirled through the hallways of the Sands and the Polo Lounge that Webb continued to live as if she had never left, keeping her presence alive through rituals that made even the most hardened Hollywood veterans shiver. To be in a room with Clifton Webb during his later years was to experience a specific kind of restless energy. There was a sensation that the air around him had grown thin and clinical. Guests at his Bel Air estate often reported a watchful presence in the house, a feeling that Maybelle's eyes were still tracking every movement from the dark corners of the parlor. There was a tragic irony in the way a man so famous for his sharp, biting wit could be so utterly hollow when the cameras stopped rolling. The atmosphere he cultivated was one of crystalline perfection, but it felt like a mausoleum. Colleagues often described cold spots in his trailer, a literal drop in temperature that seemed to follow his moods. Webb ended up in profound, echoing loneliness. He had spent decades perfecting a persona of untouchable superiority, only to find that he had successfully pushed the rest of the world away. The king of sophistication was just a frightened boy in a tuxedo, waiting for a mother who would never return to tell him the play was over. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was the heartbeat of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a diminutive powerhouse whose voice could reach the rafters of the most cavernous theaters in the world. To the average American family sitting in a darkened cinema, she was the girl next door, the innocent dreamer from Kansas who found Technicolor magic over the rainbow. However, behind the curtain of the Emerald City, Dean Martin saw a much darker reality. Dino often remarked that Judy was the most heartbreaking soul in Hollywood because her evil was not a product of malice, but of a chaotic, destructive vortex. She was a woman who had been systematically dismantled by the industry until only a jagged, desperate version of herself remained. The incident that defined her later years was not a single event, but a recurring cycle of psychological and physical collapse. By the time she was a veteran of the screen, the studio system had spent decades fueling her with amphetamines to keep her working and barbiturates to help her sleep. This chemical interference created a personality that was prone to sudden, terrifying shifts. Dean allegedly witnessed moments where the sweet, melodic Judy would vanish, replaced by a woman possessed by a frantic, clawing need for validation and escape. She would pull everyone in her orbit into her personal storm, demanding a level of emotional labor that left her friends and colleagues completely depleted. The details of Judy's final years are particularly chilling. Those who visited her dressing rooms or her various homes described a restless energy that seemed to vibrate off the walls. There was an eerie quality to her laughter, which often sounded like it was being forced out of a hollow chest. Visitors spoke of a watchful presence in her eyes, as if she was constantly scanning the room for an exit or a threat. The tragic irony of her life was that she was surrounded by millions of fans, yet lived in a state of perpetual emotional coldness. People reported cold spots in her wake, a literal sensation of the warmth leaving a room when she succumbed to her inner demons. Her existence became a series of unfinished business and missed cues. The atmosphere around her was thick with the scent of heavy perfume used to mask the medicinal odors of her various treatments. It was a sensory overload of glamour and decay. She would pace her hallways in the dead of night, humming melodies from her childhood, as if trying to find the path back to a girl named Frances Gum who had never been exploited by a movie studio. The conclusion of Judy Garland's story is a portrait of profound, agonizing loneliness. She was a woman who had been loved by the entire world, but felt she belonged to no one, not even herself. George Raft. George Raft was the undisputed king of the cinematic underworld, a man whose presence on screen was defined by a cold, reptilian stillness. He was the icon of the coin-flipping gangster, a role he played with such chilling authenticity that audiences often forgot where the performance ended and the man began. During the golden age of Hollywood, Raft was as famous for his associations off-camera as he was for his starring roles. Dean Martin, who knew the darker corners of the entertainment industry better than most, reportedly viewed Raft with a mixture of respect and genuine trepidation. Dino supposedly whispered that while other actors played tough, Raft was the bridge between the silver screen and a much more lethal reality. The core of the mystery surrounding Raft was his refusal to distance himself from the criminal underworld. He didn't just inhabit the world of the mob for research. He lived in its pocket. This created an atmosphere of constant, underlying danger on any set where he was present. The specific moment that defined this menace was not a single crime, but the persistent rumor that he acted as an emissary for figures who had no interest in the arts. Dean allegedly recalled how the air would change when Raft walked into a room. It was not the heat of a movie star's charisma, but the clinical chill of a man who knew exactly how much a human life was worth in the eyes of his associates. The details of Raft's world were thick with a watchful presence. To sit across from him was to feel as though you were being weighed and measured by a silent, invisible jury. Those who worked with him spoke of an eerie quiet that followed him, a lack of the usual Hollywood chatter. There was a restless energy to his silence, as if he were constantly waiting for a signal that only he could hear. The tragic irony of his life was that his loyalty to his friends eventually cost him his career. He was a man who lived in the gray shadows of velvet-lined booths and smoke-filled back rooms, forever looking over his shoulder for a debt that could never be fully repaid. George Raft died trying to prove he was something more than a prop for the syndicate, but the weight of his history was too heavy to lift. He ended his days as a greeter at a casino, a living relic of a dangerous era. He was a man with a golden face and a shadow made of lead, left alone with the echoes of a life lived in the service of ghosts. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock was the undisputed master of the psychological thriller, a man who transformed the internal architecture of human fear into a global brand of entertainment. To the public, he was the droll, rotund gentleman who appeared in a silhouette and spoke with a dry British wit. However, behind the masterful camera angles and the meticulously storyboarded suspense, Dean Martin allegedly recognized a much more sinister impulse. Dino reportedly suggested that Hitchcock did not just study fear. He took a sadistic pleasure in manufacturing it within the real lives of his collaborators. According to those who moved in the Rat Pack's inner circle, Hitchcock was viewed as a man who treated human emotions like gears in a clock, breaking them down just to see if he could put them back together again. The specific incidents that defined the Hitchcockian evil were his legendary and often cruel obsessions with his leading ladies. This was not a simple case of a difficult director, but a calculated and psychological campaign to dominate the spirits of women like Tippi Hedren and Kim Novak. Dean supposedly marveled at the sheer persistence of Hitchcock's control, noting that the director seemed to thrive on the genuine distress of his actors. Whether it was the literal physical trauma of the bird attacks on the set of The Birds or the emotional isolation he forced upon his stars, Hitchcock operated with a clinical lack of empathy that felt more like a predator than a storyteller. He created a workplace that felt less like a creative studio and more like an elaborate trap designed to harvest authentic terror. The details of a Hitchcock set were famously oppressive. Those who walked onto his stages described a watchful presence that was almost suffocating. The air was said to be thick with a restless energy, as if the director's own neuroses were manifesting as a physical weight in the room. There was an eerie stillness to his direction, a quiet that felt heavy with unspoken threats. The tragic irony of his career was that the man who gave the world so much excitement was himself a prisoner of deep, unshakable anxieties. He lived in a state of perpetual psychological coldness, and this temperature would often drop even further when he felt his control slipping. Colleagues reported cold spots during rehearsals, a literal sensation of the joy being sucked out of the room by his mere arrival. The atmosphere Hitchcock cultivated was one of crystalline, sterile perfection, yet it felt fundamentally wrong to those who valued human connection. His interactions were reported to be devoid of warmth, replaced instead by a sharp, intellectual cruelty that left his victims feeling spiritually drained. He was a man who understood the mechanics of the human mind perfectly, and he used that knowledge to ensure no one ever felt truly safe in his presence. Alfred Hitchcock spent his life creating nightmares for others, only to find that he could never wake up from his own. In his final years, he was a man of immense fame and even greater isolation, a figure who had mastered the art of the scream, but had forgotten how to listen to the silence of a friend. Sessue Hayakawa. Sessue Hayakawa was a figure of unparalleled magnetism during the silent film era, a man who broke racial barriers to become Hollywood's first true male sex symbol. With a gaze that seemed to pierce through the lens and into the very souls of the audience, he commanded a level of devotion that rivaled the greatest stars of his time. He lived a life of staggering opulence, navigating a world of gold-plated cars and sprawling mansions. However, Dean Martin allegedly looked past the velvet ropes and the champagne fountains, seeing a man who was deeply entwined with forces that felt ancient and unsettling. Dino reportedly believed that Hayakawa's intensity was not merely the result of acting talent, but the byproduct of a spiritual life that ventured into dark, esoteric territories. The incident that fueled these rumors involved the legendary parties hosted at Hayakawa's Argyle mansion. While the rest of Hollywood was focused on jazz and gin, these gatherings were said to take a turn toward the ritualistic. Guests whispered about an atmosphere that felt spiritually heavy, as if the very air in the house was being manipulated. There were reports of sessions where the light seemed to dim and the temperature would plummet, leaving the elite of the film world feeling an unexplainable sense of dread. Dean supposedly claimed that Hayakawa was not just a host, but a practitioner, a man who sought power through means that left those around him feeling spiritually drained and deeply uncomfortable. The sensory details of Hayakawa's presence were marked by an eerie stillness. Those who entered his inner circle described a watchful presence that seemed to emanate from the walls of his home. There was a restless energy in the silence of his rooms, a feeling that a conversation was happening just out of human earshot. Visitors frequently mentioned cold spots in his gardens, even in the heat of a California summer, suggesting a tragic irony where a man surrounded by the ultimate luxuries could never truly feel warm. The scent of heavy incense and the sight of rare, ancient artifacts created a backdrop that felt more like a temple for the forgotten than a home for a movie star. The climax of Sessue Hayakawa's story is found in his ultimate retreat from the world he had once conquered. He was a man who had everything the material world could offer, yet he seemed to be searching for a peace that remained perpetually out of reach. He eventually turned to Zen priesthood in his later years, perhaps in an attempt to quiet the restless spirits he had invited into his life during his golden years in the spotlight. Wallace Beery. Wallace Beery was one of the most recognizable faces of the early sound era. A man whose rugged, rumbling presence made him a beloved fixture of the American cinema. To the millions who flocked to see him in The Champ or Treasure Island, he was the lovable rogue, a bumbling but ultimately warm-hearted giant who could evoke a tear just as easily as a laugh. He was an Academy Award winner and, for a time, the highest-paid actor in the entire world. However, the Dean Martin, who navigated the treacherous social waters of Hollywood, supposedly saw a man who was the polar opposite of his on-screen persona. Dino allegedly described Beery as a genuine predator, a man who used his massive physical frame to intimidate and break those he deemed beneath him. The incident that remains the darkest stain on Beery's legacy involves the 1937 death of Three Stooges founder Ted Healy. According to persistent industry rumors that have refused to die for nearly a century, Beery was involved in a brutal physical altercation with Healy outside a local nightclub. While the official report attributed the death to natural causes, the whispers in the back booths of the Brown Derby told a different story of a senseless beating fueled by Beery's explosive temper. Dean allegedly remarked that the studio's ability to bury the truth about Beery was the ultimate proof of the industry's capacity for shielding monsters. This was a man who didn't just have a temper, he had a profound lack of regard for human life. The sensory details of being in Beery's presence were said to be heavy with a restless energy. Even when he was smiling for the cameras, there was a watchful presence in his eyes that suggested a hidden volatility. Those who worked on his sets described an atmosphere of constant tension, a feeling that a violent outburst was always just one missed line away. There was a tragic irony in his gentle giant branding, as the actual air around him often felt thick and suffocating. Colleagues spoke of chilling encounters in his trailer where the jovial mask would slip, revealing a coldness that felt like a physical weight. Wallace Beery's story ended in the utter lack of genuine connection he left behind. Despite his fame and his fortune, he died largely alone, with very few of his peers having a kind word to say at his passing. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was the ultimate survivor of the Hollywood studio system, a woman who reinvented herself across 5 decades to remain at the pinnacle of stardom. From the flapper of the silent era to the Oscar-winning powerhouse of the 1940s, she was the personification of iron-willed ambition and perfectly sculpted glamour. To the public, she was an inspiration, the girl from humble beginnings who willed herself into royalty. However, the Dean Martin, who attended the same elite cocktail parties and navigated the same studio backlots, allegedly saw a woman whose discipline had curdled into something far more clinical. Dino reportedly suggested that Crawford's famous intensity was actually a mask for a terrifying, sociopathic need for control that spared no one, not even her own flesh and blood. The incident that defined the darker side of the Crawford legacy was not just the physical and emotional discipline she exerted over her children, but her calculated approach to professional rivalries. She did not merely compete with other actresses, she sought to dismantle them. Dean allegedly witnessed a moment where Crawford used her significant influence to systematically sabotage a younger peer, not out of necessity, but out of a pure and jagged spite. This was a woman who lived by a code of absolute perfection, and she viewed any deviation from her standard as a personal affront. According to those in the inner circles of the Rat Pack, the evil Dean sensed was a total absence of genuine empathy, replaced by a performance of emotion that was as carefully lit as her film close-ups. The details of Crawford's world were famously cold and sterile. Those who entered her home described a watchful presence that made it impossible to relax. Everything was white, plastic-covered, and scrubbed until it was devoid of any human warmth. There was a restless energy in her movements, a constant need to organize, clean, and dominate her surroundings. Visitors spoke of an eerie quiet in her residence, a silence that felt heavy with the weight of unspoken rules and impending judgment. The tragic irony of her life was that in her quest to be the perfect star, she created a habitat that was effectively a beautiful, refrigerated tomb. Colleagues often felt a literal chill in her presence, a cold spot that seemed to emanate from her own internal rigidity. Joan Crawford was left alone with her mirrors, reflecting a woman who had conquered the world but lost her soul in the process. Peter Lorre. With his bulging, expressive eyes and a soft, nasal voice that could shift from a whimper to a threat in a single breath, Peter Lorre was the cinema's favorite personification of the uncanny. He was a brilliant actor of the German Expressionist school who found himself cast as the perpetual creep in Hollywood's golden era. To the public, he was the sinister child murderer in M or the slippery Joel Cairo in The Maltese Falcon. However, behind the tragic mask of the screen's most famous outsider, Dean Martin allegedly sensed a man who had become a vessel for a restless energy that he could no longer control. Dino reportedly believed that Lorre was haunted by the very darkness he portrayed, a man who had stared into the abyss so long that it had started to stare back. The specific tragedy that defined the evil Dean whispered about was not a malicious intent, but a deep-seated addiction and a psychological fragmentation. Lorre was a man caught between his high intellectual ambitions and the morphine habit that began after a medical crisis. Dean allegedly witnessed a version of Lorre that felt like a walking ghost, a man who seemed to exist in a different frequency than the rest of the world. There were reports of Lorre wandering the backlots of Warner Brothers with a watchful presence, looking as though he were being followed by the shadows of his own characters. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity during the rise of the Third Reich and had brought that chilling trauma with him to the sunshine of California. The sensory details of being in a room with Peter Lorre were often described as unsettling. There was an eerie quality to his kindness, a feeling that his gentle demeanor was merely a thin veil over a profound internal coldness. Those who worked with him spoke of a literal drop in the mood when he entered a scene, a cold spot that wasn't born of malice, but of a weary, spiritual exhaustion. There was a tragic irony in his career, as he was a man of immense wit and charm who was only ever allowed to play the monster. The air around him was said to be thick with the scent of heavy tobacco and a sense of unfinished business, as if he were perpetually waiting for a redemption that the industry would never grant him. The Shadow King was a man who had lost his way in the labyrinth of his own talent, leaving behind a body of work that remains as chilling and unresolved as the life he led behind the camera. Laurence Harvey. Laurence Harvey was the personification of post-war cynicism, a man whose sharp features and clipped mid-Atlantic accent made him the quintessential screen opportunist. From his breakout role in Room at the Top to the brainwashed assassin in The Manchurian Candidate, Harvey possessed a screen presence that was as magnetic as it was unnerving. To the movie-going public, he was the sophisticated rebel, a man who navigated the complexities of the modern world with a glass of scotch in one hand and a biting insult in the other. However, Dean Martin allegedly looked into Harvey's pale eyes and saw a total, chilling void. Dino reportedly claimed that Harvey did not just play cold characters, but that he was a man fundamentally devoid of human warmth, a hollow shell dressed in a bespoke suit. The incident that solidified this reputation was Harvey's legendary and public display of malice toward his colleagues and lovers alike. He was known for a brand of black-hearted wit that went far beyond mere teasing, often bordering on the predatory. Dean supposedly recounted stories of Harvey's behavior on various European film sets, where he would use his immense charm to manipulate others for sport. There was no grand tragedy or sympathetic trauma to explain his behavior. Instead, there was a sense of a man who simply felt nothing for the people around him. He moved through the world like a clinical observer, harvesting the emotions of others while remaining entirely untouched himself. The sensory details of Harvey's presence were marked by a literal cold spot in the center of the most crowded Hollywood parties. Those who spoke with him often described an eerie lack of resonance in his voice, as if he were speaking from a place that had never known the sun. There was a watchful presence in his stillness, a feeling that he was always calculating the most efficient way to achieve his next goal. The tragic irony of his life was that he achieved the height of fame and luxury, only to find that he had no capacity to enjoy it. His atmosphere was one of restless energy and unfinished business, leaving behind a legacy of broken spirits and a reputation as the coldest man to ever grace the silver screen. This list, according to those close to the Martin estate, wasn't born of bitterness, but of a weary clarity. Dean Martin spent his life in the spotlight, a place where the glare often blinds you to the truth of the person standing right next to you. Perhaps these 9 weren't evil in the way the movies define it. Perhaps they were just humans who lost their way in the labyrinth of fame, becoming ghosts long before they actually died. As the last notes of Everybody Loves Somebody fade into the night, we're left to wonder, in the city of dreams, who is watching the dreamers? Is there a name from the golden age you think belongs on this list? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of Hollywood, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more unresolved mysteries and the hidden lives of the elite.